Welcome back to the deep dive. For today's deep dive, we're tackling a question that one of you sent us. Who is a Buddhist? And to get to the bottom of this, we're going to be looking at a fascinating document that really digs deep into the history and meaning of Buddhism.
It's a question that I think a lot of people have pondered at some point,
Yeah,
and it's not always an easy one to answer.
it's a question that seems simple on the surface, but it gets complicated fast.
Exactly. And this document, it jumps right into that complexity by kind of challenging some common assumptions about Buddhism.
Like right off the bat, it points out that the label Buddhist didn't even appear until centuries after the Buddha died.
Yeah, it's true. The term itself emerged from those later classifications of his teachings, like Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism, about 300 years after the Buddha passed away.
Wow, so the very label that we use to define this tradition has a history that's more nuanced than we might think.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that things aren't always as straightforward as they seem.
Okay, so before we get too lost in the historical weeds here, I'm curious about something the document mentions about the word Buddha itself.
Ah, yes. The document dives deep into the etymology of Buddha and breaks down the word. It's made up of two parts from the ancient Magadhi language, Bu and Uda. Bu is the past tense of becoming, and Uda means like complete uprooting.
Okay, so if we break down the word Buddha, literally means someone who has completely uprooted something. What exactly are they uprooting?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. The document introduces this concept of bhava. Think of it like mental quicksand. The more we struggle, the deeper we sink. Bhava refers to all those mental properties that keep us stuck. Raga, which is attachment, devesha, which is aversion, and moha, which is delusion.
So like a Buddha is someone who has found a way to step out of that mental quicksand.
Exactly. A Buddha has completely freed themselves from these bhavas, these mental patterns that keep us trapped in suffering. And that freedom is directly related to the Buddha's teachings, which the document emphasizes are not meant to be like some kind of rigid philosophy or dogma.
Yeah, they're presented as a practical path to end suffering.
Right, and it's all about taking action. In fact, the document says that the essence of these teachings can be summarized in a single stanza. Stop all immoral actions associate with wholesome qualities and purify your mind through careful thought appraisal.
Okay, so it's not just about thinking good thoughts, but also about actively shaping our actions and our way of being in the world.
That's it. And it makes me think of mindfulness, which has become so popular in recent years.
Yeah, mindfulness is everywhere these days.
But the document reminds us that true mindfulness, as the Buddha taught it, involves recognizing the impermanent, unsatisfactory, and selfless nature of reality.
Okay, can you unpack that a little bit?
Well, think of it this way. We often cling to things as if they are permanent, satisfying, and part of me or mine. But the Buddha's teachings encourage us to see the truth. Everything is constantly changing. Nothing can truly satisfy us for long, and there's no fixed self to cling to.
So it's about like waking up to the reality of how things actually are rather than how we wish them to be.
Exactly. And this shift in perspective can be incredibly freeing, but it requires practice.
Right.
The document highlights one specific practice that the Buddha himself recommended as the path to achieving this freedom.
Oh, really? What is it?
It's called Ana-pana samadhi bhavana.
Ana-pana samadhi bhavana. Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but it's a powerful practice.
So what is it about?
Well, you can think of it like this. Imagine noticing your thoughts like clouds passing by. That's a taste of what this practice is about. It's a deep cognitive process aimed at purifying the mind by associating with wholesome thoughts and dissociating from those unwholesome ones that lead to suffering.
So it's like rewiring your brain to break free from negative thought loops?
You got it. And get this, the Buddha himself said this practice could lead to enlightenment in as little as a week.
Enlightenment in a week? Wow, that's a pretty bold claim. But before we dive deeper into Ana-pana samadhi bhavana, I'm curious about something else the document mentions about the history of Buddhism. It claims that how Buddhism is practiced today might not be exactly what the Buddha originally taught.
Ah, yes. The document gets into some of the historical twists and turns that Buddhism has taken over the centuries.
So what happened?
Well, the document argues that about 200 years after the Buddha's death,
Uh-huh.
certain interpretations of his teachings started to solidify. And then about 900 years later, those interpretations were further shaped by a key figure named Acharya Buddhaghosa.
Okay, so we're talking almost a millennium after the Buddha. That's a lot of time for things to get lost in translation.
Right. And it's important to note that Buddhaghosa himself admitted to altering the original teachings and incorporating ideas from other philosophies when he wrote his commentaries on the scriptures.
So was he intentionally trying to distort the Buddhist teachings, or was he just trying to make them more relevant to his own time?
That's a complex question.
Yeah.
And the document delves into the motivations and impact of Buddhaghosa's work. But it also highlights a crucial point. The original Tipitaka, the collection of Buddhist scriptures, was carefully preserved in Sri Lanka, and it was often neglected in favor of these later interpretations.
Ah, so that's where those distortions really started to take hold.
It's a possibility.
Yeah.
And it raises a really important question. If we're trying to understand what it truly means to be a Buddhist, wouldn't it make sense to go back to those original teachings, the ones preserved in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, that makes sense. So where do we even begin? Buddhism is such a vast and complex tradition.
Well, that's something we'll definitely be exploring further as we continue this deep dive.
Awesome, I can't wait.
But first, is there anything from this initial exploration that is standing out to you? Any big aha moments?
Yeah. Honestly, I'm already feeling like my understanding of Buddhism needs a serious reboot. I thought I knew a thing or two about mindfulness and the middle path, but it seems like I've only scratched the surface.
I think that's a common experience.
Yeah.
And it's a great starting point for this deep dive. We're going to challenge those assumptions and uncover a deeper understanding of what it truly means to follow the Buddha's path.
I'm ready to dive in.
So picking up where we left off this document,
Yeah.
really takes aim at this idea that Buddhism is all about creating this perfect, blissful state of mind, almost like the mind is this unchanging essence.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because the document actually uses this phrase that the mind is always and everywhere like space,
Right.
which I've definitely heard before.
Right, like it's supposed to be this pure, unchanging essence, the only thing that doesn't change.
Exactly.
But the document is like, no, even the mind is subject to change and impermanence, just like everything else.
So it's not about like detaching from the world or trying to transcend our physical experience. It's more about like facing the truth of our experience, however messy or uncomfortable it might be.
You got it. And it's also not about clinging to external values or seeking validation from some kind of teacher or guru. The document actually uses this term, sila vathaparamasa, to describe that tendency.
Sila vathaparamasa. Okay, that one's definitely going in my vocabulary notebook.
It's a mouthful.
Yeah.
But it basically means getting caught up in rituals and external practices instead of doing the real inner work.
Gotcha. So it's like thinking that buying a fancy yoga mat will automatically make you enlightened.
Exactly. It's the inner transformation that matters.
Yeah.
The uprooting of those bhavas, attachment, aversion, and delusion that we were talking about earlier.
Okay, but this whole idea of uprooting bhava, does that mean we're supposed to become like emotionless robots?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of what the Buddha meant by liberation.
Okay.
It's not about becoming emotionless, but about recognizing the impermanent nature of those feelings and not letting them control us. The document uses this really interesting word, inebriation.
Inebriation.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly intoxicated by the world around us, chasing after pleasure, avoiding pain, without ever really seeing things clearly.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
And the true middle path is about achieving liberation from that intoxication. It's about reaching a state of clarity and freedom from those mental chains, which is what the terms Maji and Ma actually refer to.
So the middle path isn't about compromise, it's about liberation.
That's it.
It's like realizing you don't need that extra slice of cake to be happy. True happiness comes from within.
You got it.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the historical narrative that this document presents. It focuses on the evolution of Buddhism in Helabima, the ancient name for Sri Lanka.
Right.
And it claims that what we know as Buddhism today is like a distorted version of the original teachings that were preserved in Helabima for centuries.
Yeah, and it really kind of points the finger at Acharya Buddhaghosa, suggesting he had his own agenda when he wrote those commentaries on the scriptures.
It's almost like he took the Buddha's teachings and remixed them to fit his own worldview.
The document also points out that he replaced certain Magadhi terms with Sanskrit words, which was explicitly forbidden by the Buddha.
Wait, why would that be forbidden?
Because language carries subtle nuances and connotations that can dramatically alter the meaning of a text. The Buddha was very specific about using the language of the people the Magadhi language to ensure that his teachings were accessible and clear.
Ah, so Buddhaghosa wasn't just changing the content, he was changing the very language of the teachings.
Right, and that's a significant shift.
But if these distortions were so widespread, how did they become like the accepted version of Buddhism?
Well, the document points to several factors, including the political climate of the time and the influence of powerful individuals.
Okay.
It specifically mentions Emperor Ashoka, who is often credited with spreading Buddhism throughout India.
Right, I've heard of Ashoka.
But the document argues that Ashoka actually promoted a distorted version of Buddhism, almost using it as a political tool to unify his empire.
So Buddhism, which began as a path to liberation from suffering, was transformed into a state-sponsored religion.
That's the argument.
Wow. So what we think of as Buddhism today might be a far cry from what the Buddha actually taught.
It's a possibility. But remember, this is just one perspective, one interpretation of history. What's important is that we're willing to question those assumptions and dig deeper into the source material.
Yeah, that's a good point.
This document encourages us to be critical thinkers and approach Buddhism with a discerning eye.
Okay, so speaking of a discerning eye, let's talk about some of the specific errors that this document identifies in conventional Buddhism. One of the biggest areas of contention seems to be the concept of mindfulness.
Yeah, the document argues that mindfulness, as it's often practiced today, it's kind of become more of a self-help technique focused on reducing stress and improving focus
Right.
than a path to liberation from suffering.
But isn't mindfulness as it's practiced today still helpful, even if it's not exactly what the Buddha intended?
That's a valid point. And the document acknowledges that mindfulness practices can have benefits, but it emphasizes that the Buddha's teachings on mindfulness went much deeper.
Okay.
It was about cultivating a profound understanding of cause and effect, which he called Hetupala Dhamma,
Eshupaladam.
and an awareness of the interconnectedness of all things known as Naya Vinaya.
Naya Vinaya. Okay, got it. So it's not just about observing your thoughts and feelings without judgment. It's about understanding their root causes and seeing how they connect to the bigger picture.
Exactly. And this misunderstanding of mindfulness extends to the way that the four foundations of mindfulness are often taught.
Right. Those are the four practices that encourage mindfulness of the body, feelings, mind, and mental objects.
Yes. But they're often presented as separate exercises, and the document argues that they should be seen as interconnected aspects of a single practice. It all starts with Kayanupatthana mindfulness of the body, which is like the foundation upon which all other forms of mindfulness are built.
So it's not about jumping between different types of mindfulness, but about cultivating a holistic awareness that encompasses all aspects of our experience.
You got it.
Okay, so we've talked about mindfulness. What other errors does the document highlight?
Well, we've already touched on the way that the middle path is often misinterpreted.
Yeah.
It's often seen as finding a balance between extremes. But the document argues that the true middle path is about complete liberation from attachment to sensory experiences, achieving that state of Nibbana.
And that liberation is achieved through the practice of Ana-pana, sati, samadhi, bhavana, right?
Yes. But even this practice, the document argues, has been distorted in conventional Buddhism.
Really?
It's often reduced to simply observing the breath,
Oh.
which misses the deeper cognitive process that the Buddha intended.
It's like thinking that just watching a cooking show will make you a chef. There's so much more to it than meets the eye.
Exactly. And that brings us to an important question. If all of these distortions are so widespread, how can we possibly get back to the heart of the Buddha's teachings?
I was just thinking the same thing. It feels a little overwhelming.
It can be. But the document offers some guidance. It suggests that we need to start by questioning our assumptions and challenging the conventional narrative about Buddhism.
So being willing to say, okay, maybe what I thought I knew about Buddhism isn't entirely accurate.
Exactly. And it encourages us to dig deeper, to explore the original teachings for ourselves.
But where do we even begin? The Buddhist scriptures are vast.
Right. That's where the document highlights the importance of finding a qualified teacher, a Kalyana who can guide us on the path to liberation.
Kalyanamita, okay.
But it also cautions against blindly following anyone who claims to have all the answers.
So it's not about finding a guru who will tell us what to think, but about finding a mentor who can help us learn how to think for ourselves.
Precisely. It requires discernment and a willingness to look beyond external appearances and credentials. The document encourages us to evaluate potential teachers carefully using the principles of Hetupala Dhamma and Naya Vinaya as our guide.
So we should be looking at their actions and teachings, not just their titles or robes.
Exactly. Remember, the true measure of a Buddhist is not their words, but their actions.
Right, like that quote from the Vasala Sutta, one becomes an outcast or a Brahmin by their own deeds.
That applies perfectly to being a Buddhist. It's about embodying the qualities of compassion, wisdom, and ethical conduct in our daily lives.
So maybe instead of asking who is a Buddhist, we should be asking how can I live in a way that embodies the Buddha's teachings?
That's a wonderful reframing. And it leads us back to the core message of this document. Being a Buddhist is not about adhering to a set of beliefs or rituals.
Yeah.
It's about embodying a way of life that leads to liberation from suffering.
And that liberation isn't something we achieve once and for all, right? It's an ongoing process, a journey of self-discovery and growth.
Exactly. And this journey takes us beyond the realm of intellectual understanding into the realm of direct experience. The document reminds us that the Buddha's teachings aren't meant to be just studied and debated. They're meant to be put into practice.
So it's not enough to just talk the talk, we have to walk the walk.
Precisely. And that walk might look different for each of us, but the direction is always the same, towards liberation from suffering.
This document has definitely given me a lot to think about. But before we wrap up this part of the deep dive, I'm curious to learn more about the document's take on the Tipitaka, the collection of Buddhist scriptures.
Ah, yes, the Tipitaka.
It seems like the document really emphasizes the importance of the original Tipitaka, the one that was carefully preserved in Sri Lanka for centuries.
Right, it highlights the pristine nature of those teachings.
And it's critical of the more recent Buddha Jayanti Tipitaka series, which was compiled in the mid-20th century.
Yeah, the document raises some concerns about that newer edition.
Why is that?
Well, it claims that the newer edition contains errors and distortions that have further muddied the waters of Buddhist understanding.
Oh, really?
It points out that the commissioners of the Buddha Jayanti Tipitaka series relied on imported versions of the scriptures from Burma and Thailand, rather than consulting the original Sri Lankan texts.
So even well-intentioned efforts to preserve and disseminate the Buddhist teachings can inadvertently introduce errors and distortions.
That's the argument.
Okay, so all this talk about distortions and errors might make it seem like the Buddha's original teachings are lost forever.
I understand that concern, but the document offers a glimmer of hope. It claims that the pristine teachings are still accessible to those who are willing to seek them out, and it emphasizes the importance of finding a qualified teacher, a Kalyanamitta, who can guide us on the path.
But finding such a teacher is no easy feat.
You're right. It requires discernment and a willingness to look beyond external appearances and credentials. The document warns against blindly following those who claim to be guardians of the Buddhist tradition and encourages us to evaluate their actions and teachings carefully.
So it's about looking beyond labels and titles and focusing on the substance of their teachings and the integrity of their conduct.
Precisely. And it's about remembering that the true measure of a Buddhist is not their words, but their actions.
Because, as the Vasala Sutta reminds us, one becomes an outcast or a Brahmin by their own deeds.
And the same applies to being a Buddhist. It's about embodying the qualities of compassion, wisdom, and ethical conduct in our daily lives.
That's a powerful reminder that this deep dive isn't just about understanding Buddhism as an intellectual concept, but about reflecting on how we can cultivate these qualities in our own lives.
And that cultivation starts with questioning our assumptions and being open to new perspectives. This document certainly challenges the conventional narrative about Buddhism, and it invites us to embark on our own journey of discovery.
And speaking of discovery, I'm curious to hear more about the document's claim that the Buddha himself said that the practice of Ana-pana, sati, samadhi, bhavana could lead to enlightenment in as little as 7 days.
That's quite a claim, and it definitely sparks curiosity. But it's important to remember that this practice isn't as simple as it might sound.
Yeah.
It's a profound cognitive process that requires deep concentration and a thorough understanding of the Buddhist teachings. It's not about simply observing the breath,
Right.
but about using the breath as an anchor to cultivate a state of deep awareness and insight.
So it's not a quick fix, but a practice that requires dedication and effort.
Exactly. And it's a practice that goes beyond the realm of the mind. The document emphasizes that Ana-pana samadhi bhavana is about skillfully associating with wholesome thoughts and dissociating from unwholesome ones.
So it's about aligning our thoughts, words, and actions with the path of liberation.
That's right. And it's about doing so with a deep understanding of cause and effect, recognizing that our actions have consequences, both for ourselves and for others.
This idea of enlightenment in 7 days is really fascinating. What do you think the document is trying to convey with this claim?
I think it's speaking to the potential that lies within each of us to awaken to our true nature. But it's also reminding us that the path to awakening is not a linear progression. It's a journey filled with twists and turns, challenges and triumphs.
And it's a journey that we must undertake with patience, compassion, and an open mind.
Because the true destination is not a fixed point in time or space, but a state of being that we cultivate through our daily actions, thoughts, and intentions. And it's a state of being that we can access right here, right now, if we're willing to do the work.
That's a powerful message to leave us with. I'm feeling inspired to explore this practice of Ana-pana, sati, samadhi, bhavana further.
That's wonderful. Remember, the path to awakening is always open to those who are willing to seek it.
Well, it seems like we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We've explored the history of Buddhism, the distortions that have crept into the tradition, and the true meaning of the Buddhist teachings.
We've also discussed the importance of critical thinking and the need to question our assumptions about Buddhism.
And we've highlighted the essential qualities that define a true Buddhist qualities that we can all cultivate in our own lives.
But this deep dive has also raised some new questions for me, especially this idea of enlightenment in 7 days. What does that actually mean? What does that process look like?
Those are great questions, and I think they're a perfect segue into the final part of our deep dive.
I'm ready to keep exploring.
So, we've been talking a lot about distortions and errors and all that.
Yeah.
But, this document, it doesn't just focus on the negative.
Right.
It also reminds us that those original teachings, the ones preserved in Helabima,
Yeah.
they offer a powerful antidote. It's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
So we don't need to completely reject Buddhism just because there have been some distortions along the way.
Exactly. There's still so much value to be found in the tradition, even with its imperfections. It's like recognizing that a beautiful old painting might have some cracks and faded colors, but the masterpiece is still there waiting to be rediscovered.
I love that analogy.
So it's not about blindly accepting everything we hear, but about carefully looking for those gems of wisdom that lie beneath the surface.
Okay, I'm ready to start digging. Where do we find these gems?
Well, as we've been talking about, those gems are found in the original teachings. The ones that emphasize uprooting bhava, cultivating tiyeni sucharitha, and ultimately achieving liberation from suffering.
It's a good reminder that the true essence of Buddhism isn't about dogma or ritual, but about a deep inner transformation.
Yes. And that transformation doesn't happen overnight.
Definitely not. It's an ongoing process.
Right. It requires patience and dedication and a willingness to face our own inner demons. It's not about finding a quick fix, but embracing the journey of self-discovery and growth.
And, speaking of that journey, the document really stresses the importance of finding a qualified teacher, a kalyanamitta.
Ah, yes, the kalyanamitta.
Someone who can guide us on the path.
Right. But finding such a teacher can be a challenge.
Oh, yeah. Especially in a world where, so many people claim to have the answers.
Exactly. That's where discernment comes in.
So it's not about blindly following someone just because they have a certain title or status.
Exactly. The document encourages us to evaluate potential teachers carefully, using the principles of dhamma and Vinaya.
Those ideas of cause and effect and interconnectedness that we talked about before.
Yes. So you're looking at their actions and teachings, not just their robes or their popularity.
Gotcha. So trust your gut.
Trust your gut. It's like finding a skilled navigator to guide you through uncharted waters.
Okay, so let's talk about language for a second.
Okay.
The document spends quite a bit of time talking about language and its importance in understanding the Buddhist teachings. It's critical of using Sanskrit terms in translations of the Tipitaka, arguing that this has led to distortions. Why is that such a big deal?
Well, because language shapes our thoughts and perceptions. Even subtle changes in wording can have a huge impact on meaning, especially when it comes to something as complex as the Buddha's teachings.
Yeah, so it's like hearing a song in its original language versus a translated version. Something gets lost in translation.
That's a great way to put it. And the document argues that this loss of meaning has contributed to many of those distortions we've been talking about. It's a call to return to the source, to rediscover the beauty and power of the Buddha's teachings in their original form.
That makes a lot of sense. And this whole conversation has really highlighted the importance of, being humble and open-minded and willing to challenge our own assumptions.
It's a continual process of learning and unlearning.
Well, our deep dive into who is a Buddhist has certainly taken us on quite a journey. We've explored the history of Buddhism, uncovered some surprising facts, and challenged some common assumptions.
We've gone deep.
We've delved into the heart of the Buddha's teachings and discovered a path to liberation that's both profound and practical.
And I think what's really important is that we've seen how critical thinking and discernment are essential tools for navigating this path.
Exactly. So for everyone listening out there,
Yeah, to all our deep divers.
we encourage you to explore the source material yourself and continue on your own journey of discovery.
Remember, the path to awakening is always open to those who are willing to seek it.
And the real measure of a Buddhist isn't about labels or rituals, but about the actions we take and the qualities we cultivate in our daily lives.
So ask yourself, what does it truly mean to live in a way that embodies compassion, wisdom, and ethical conduct? That's the real question at the heart of this deep dive.
And it's a question worth pondering as you continue on your own unique path.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.